You ever have someone call the police on you in your own driveway and smile like they just did the right thing? The smell of burnt coffee hit me before I even stepped out of the truck, sharp and bitter, mixing with the faint scent of fresh-cut grass that every house in Willow Creek Estates seemed to obsess over, like perfection could be measured in inches and silence, and for a second everything felt normal, just another early morning, just another quiet street, until the garage door started rolling up and the world snapped in half with the sound of sirens cutting through the air, not distant, not passing by, but coming straight at me, red and blue lights bouncing off the chrome of my truck, painting the inside of my garage in flashing colors like some kind of warning I'd already seen before, and then the doors slammed, 3 of them, heavy and official, boots on pavement, quick, controlled, trained, sir, step away from the vehicle, calm voices, but tight, like they were already convinced of something, and I just stood there for a second with my keys still in my hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle in, not panic, not confusion, just that quiet shift when you realize someone else just made a very big mistake, and then I saw her, Linda Whitmore, HOA president, standing just behind them on the sidewalk, phone still in her hand like it was a badge of authority, her posture straight, chin slightly raised, that same polished smile she used at every neighborhood meeting when she talked about community standards and property values, like they were laws carved in stone, except this time there was something else behind it, something sharper, satisfaction, like she'd finally caught me doing something wrong, like all those warnings and fines and sideways looks had finally paid off. That's him, she said, pointing like she was identifying a stranger instead of the guy who lived right across from her perfectly trimmed hedges, and I could still remember the first time she knocked on my door, clipboard in hand, measuring tape dangling from her wrist, talking about my garage being visually disruptive, the way her perfume hung in the air a second too long after she left, sweet but heavy, like it was trying to cover something underneath, and every interaction after that just escalated. Notices slipped into my mailbox, emails with bolded words and legal tone, warnings about compliance and consequences, all built on the assumption that I was just another guy she could push around, another homeowner who'd fold under pressure, and I let her think that, I really did, because sometimes the best move isn't to push back, it's to wait, to watch, to see how far someone is willing to go when they think they're in control. And now here we were, 3 officers standing between me and my own garage, one of them already resting a hand near his belt, not aggressive, just ready, the kind of readiness that comes from routine, from believing the call they responded to was legitimate, and I raised my hands slowly, not because I had to, but because it made everything easier. The metal of my keys cool against my palm before I set them on the hood, the morning air still cool against my skin, and in that moment I could feel Linda's eyes on me, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to argue, to protest, to prove her right in some way, but I didn't give her that. I just stood there, calm, steady, because what she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that this wasn't going to play out the way she imagined, not even close, and somewhere down the street another engine turned over. Another car pulling up, tires crunching softly against the asphalt, and I didn't have to turn around to know that this was where everything was about to change. The second engine cut off behind the patrol cars with a low, controlled hum, different from the others, deliberate, like it belonged there, and I watched one of the officers glance over his shoulder instinctively, just for a split second, the kind of reflex you only pick up after years on the job, when you start recognizing which arrivals matter and which ones do not, and the air shifted, subtle but real. Like the temperature dropped a few degrees without anyone saying a word, and Linda did not notice it at first. She was still focused on me, still holding on to that moment like it was hers to control, her fingers tightening slightly around her phone, knuckles whitening just enough to give away the tension under that polished exterior, and I could hear the faint buzz of the neighborhood waking up, sprinklers ticking on in perfect intervals, a garage door 2 houses down rattling open, someone starting their morning routine completely unaware that right here, on this quiet stretch of concrete, a very different kind of routine was about to break apart, and one of the officers stepped a little closer to me, voice steady, professional, asking for identification, the kind of request that usually comes with assumptions already attached, and I nodded once, slow, deliberate, like I had all the time in the world, because in that moment, I did, reaching into my back pocket carefully, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise, and as I handed over my wallet I could feel Linda's eyes tracking every movement. waiting for something, anything, that would confirm the story she had already decided was true, but what she did not understand was that I had spent years in rooms where decisions carried real weight, where people did not raise their voices because they did not need to, where authority was not something you performed but something you carried quietly until it mattered, and this, right here, this was not pressure, this was just another situation unfolding exactly the way it needed to. The officer flipped through my identification, scanning it quickly, his expression neutral but focused, and then I saw it, just the slightest pause, the smallest shift in his posture, not enough for Linda to catch, but enough for me to recognize, because I had seen that reaction before, the moment when information does not line up with expectation, when a simple call starts to feel a little more complicated than it should be, and behind him, the car door from the second vehicle opened, a solid, familiar sound, followed by measured footsteps approaching, not hurried, not uncertain, just confident, and I did not turn right away, I did not need to, because I already knew what was coming next. The pieces had been in place long before this morning, long before Linda decided to make that call, and then I heard the voice, low, controlled, carrying just enough authority to cut through the tension without raising it. What is going on here? And that was when Linda finally shifted her attention, turning with that same practiced smile, ready to explain, ready to present her version of events, but the moment she saw him, something flickered, just a hint of recognition mixed with confusion, because this was not how she expected it to go, not at all, and the officer in front of me straightened slightly, handing my wallet back with a different kind of respect than before, subtle, but undeniable, and I took it without breaking eye contact, slipping it back into my pocket as the footsteps stopped just a few feet away, and then, finally, I turned, slow and calm, meeting the eyes of the man who had just arrived, and for a fraction of a second everything went completely still, like the entire street held its breath. And I watched the recognition hit him, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just immediate and real, the kind that changes everything without a single word needing to be said, and in that silence, I could feel the balance shift, not loudly, not violently, just quietly, like a door closing behind someone who had no idea they had just walked into the wrong room. The word left his mouth before he could stop it, quiet but sharp enough to slice through everything, sir, and it landed in the air like a dropped piece of glass, small, almost fragile, but impossible to ignore, and I watched Linda's smile freeze in place, not disappear, not yet, just hold there a second too long, like her brain needed time to catch up with what her ears had just heard, and the officer standing next to me shifted his weight, just slightly, shoulders pulling back, posture adjusting in that automatic way people do when the chain of command suddenly becomes clear, and the man who had just stepped out of the car, Mark Whitmore, stood there with his hand still on the door for a moment, eyes locked on mine, recognition fully settled now, not confusion, not hesitation, just that quiet realization that this situation had already moved past his control the second he arrived, and I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, not out of anger, but out of calculation, running through everything he had just walked into, the call, the report, the officers already on scene, his wife standing 10 feet away expecting validation, and none of it lining up the way it should, and Linda finally let out a small laugh, light, dismissive, like she was trying to smooth over something she did not yet understand. Mark, thank God you are here. This man has been trespassing and refusing to comply, I told them. He has been a problem for weeks, her voice steady but just a little higher than before, just enough to betray the tension creeping in, and Mark did not look at her right away, he kept his eyes on me, and that was when the silence stretched, longer than it should have, long enough for everyone else to start noticing that something was off, and I could hear the faint click of a sprinkler head turning somewhere across the street, the rhythmic ticking filling the space where Linda expected immediate agreement, immediate action, and it never came, because Mark finally spoke again, slower this time, measured. Ma'am, can you step back for a moment? And that word, ma'am, hit harder than anything else he could have said, formal, distant, completely different from the casual tone of a husband backing up his wife, and Linda blinked, once, then again, like she was trying to reset the scene. What do you mean step back? I called this in, I need you to handle this, and there it was. That insistence, that belief that she was still in control, still directing how this would play out, and I could almost feel the moment tipping, that invisible line where authority shifts from assumed to real, and Mark took one step closer, not toward her, but toward me, subtle, but unmistakable, and lowered his voice just enough that it carried weight without drawing attention. "Sir, I was not aware you had moved into this neighborhood." Calm, respectful, and final, and I nodded once, just a small acknowledgement, because that was all it took. No badge flashed, no explanation needed, just recognition between two people who understood exactly what that word meant, and behind us, one of the officers cleared his throat quietly, the kind of sound people make when they realize they are standing in the middle of something bigger than they expected, and Linda's expression finally cracked, not dramatically, just a small fracture at the edges, confusion bleeding into disbelief, her eyes moving from Mark to me and back again, searching for something that would make sense of it. "Wait, what is going on? Why are you calling him sir?" And her voice lost that polished edge, just a little, enough to reveal the uncertainty underneath, and I could see the moment she started replaying everything in her head, every warning she had given me, every fine she had issued, every time she had spoken to me like I was beneath her authority, stacking those memories against what she was hearing now, and none of it fitting together, and the street felt quieter than before. Like the entire neighborhood had pulled back just enough to let this moment settle, and I took a slow breath, steady, controlled. Because this was the part where most people would say something, would explain, would assert, but I did not need to, not yet, because the truth had already started doing the work for me, and all that was left was for it to finish unfolding right in front of her. The air did not snap or explode, it just shifted, like something invisible slid into place and locked, and I watched Linda take a half step forward, not aggressive, just confused, like she was trying to physically move closer to the version of reality she thought she was still in control of. "Mark, I asked you a question," her voice tighter now, the smooth confidence from earlier starting to crack around the edges, and Mark finally turned to face her fully, not rushed, not defensive, just deliberate, "the way you address something that needs to be handled correctly the first time. Linda, I need you to listen carefully," he said, each word measured. And that alone told me everything, because this was no longer a conversation between husband and wife, this was procedure, and procedure does not bend for personal comfort, and I could see it hit her, not all at once, but in small pieces, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her grip on her phone loosened just slightly, like her body was starting to realize what her mind had not caught up to yet, and around us the officers had gone completely still, not frozen, just attentive, recalibrating, their earlier posture of control replaced by something quieter, more precise, waiting for direction instead of assuming it, and I took a slow step back toward my garage, not retreating, just reclaiming space that had always been mine, the concrete cool under my boots, the faint hum of the garage door motor still echoing in my ears, and Linda noticed that movement immediately, her eyes snapping back to me. "Do not move," she said, instinctively, reflexively, like she needed to reassert something, anything, to keep this from slipping away, but the words hung there with no weight behind them, and no one moved to enforce them, not even Mark, and that was the moment the illusion started to collapse in real time. Because authority that is real does not need to be repeated, and authority that is assumed falls apart the second it is questioned, and Mark exhaled slowly, like he was choosing his next words with care. "This is not a trespassing situation," he said, not loud, but firm enough that it carried across the driveway, and Linda blinked again, faster this time, her composure slipping just a little more. "What do you mean it is not? He has been violating HOA regulations for weeks. I have documented everything," and there it was again, the clipboard logic, the belief that paperwork and rules gave her jurisdiction over everything she could see, and I could not help but notice how small that sounded now, how limited, how completely out of place in a moment that had already moved far beyond neighborhood guidelines and neatly trimmed lawns, and Mark shook his head once, not dismissive, just final, "That is not relevant here," and the silence that followed was heavier than anything said before. Because now there was no misunderstanding left, no room for interpretation, just a clear line drawn between what she thought mattered and what actually did, and I could see it in her eyes, the realization starting to settle, slow and uncomfortable, like stepping into water you thought was shallow only to find it much deeper than expected. And one of the officers shifted his stance again, this time stepping slightly away from me, not dramatically, just enough to create distance where there had been tension before, and I reached up and brushed a bit of dust off the hood of my truck, a small, ordinary motion that felt almost out of place in the middle of everything, but that was the point. Normalcy returning on my terms, not hers, and Linda's voice came out again. Softer now, uncertain. Mark, you are not making sense. Why are you acting like this? And for the first time since this started, there was something almost vulnerable in it, not weakness, just the sound of someone realizing they no longer understood the situation they thought they controlled, and Mark looked at her for a long second before answering, and when he did, his tone did not change, still calm, still controlled, but carrying something heavier underneath, because you did not call this in on the person you think you did, and that sentence settled over the driveway like a final piece clicking into place, and I could feel every set of eyes shift back to me, not questioning anymore, just waiting, and I met Linda's gaze, steady and quiet, because now she was finally looking at me the way she should have from the beginning, not as a problem to manage, not as a rule to enforce, but as someone she had completely misjudged. And the only thing left was for her to understand just how far off she had been. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, not because anyone was unsure anymore, but because everyone was recalculating, and I could see Linda doing it in real time, her eyes moving between Mark and me, trying to find something familiar to hold on to, something that would pull this back into the version of control she understood, but there was nothing left to grab, and that was the problem, because everything she had built her confidence on, the rules, the notices, the authority she believed came with her title, none of it applied here, not anymore, and she swallowed once, subtle, but visible, her voice coming out slower this time, more careful, then. Who exactly did I call this in on? And that question hung in the air heavier than anything else she had said so far, because now she was asking for clarity she could not undo, and Mark did not answer right away. He looked at me first, just for a second, not asking permission, just acknowledging the line that had already been crossed, and I gave the smallest nod, barely noticeable, but enough. Because there was no reason to hold it back any longer, the situation had already revealed itself, and Mark turned back to her, shoulders squared, voice steady. You called this in on my supervisor, and the word landed clean, precise, final, and I watched it hit her, not like a shock, not like something explosive, but like weight, slow and heavy, settling into place piece by piece until it could not be ignored, and her mouth opened slightly, then closed again, like she was trying to respond but could not quite find the right version of reality to respond from anymore, and one of the officers behind her shifted his stance again, this time stepping back half a foot, creating space without making a scene, the kind of movement that says everything without saying anything at all, and I leaned lightly against the edge of my truck, casual, grounded, letting the moment breathe, because this was not about making a point, it was about letting the truth do exactly what it always does when given enough time, and Linda finally spoke again. Quieter now, the sharp edges gone, replaced by something uncertain, supervisor of what, and there it was, the last thread she could pull, the last attempt to frame this in a way that still made sense to her, and Mark exhaled slowly, not frustrated, just measured, like he had already accepted where this was going. Federal Bureau of Investigation, he said, each word clear, deliberate, impossible to misinterpret, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, just absolute, like a switch had been flipped somewhere behind her eyes. And I could see the shift, the way her posture changed, the way her shoulders dropped just slightly, the way her grip on her phone loosened completely this time, the device lowering a few inches without her even realizing it, and the street felt different now, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered, and I could hear a car pass slowly at the end of the block, tires humming against the asphalt, the normal world continuing just out of reach of this moment, and Linda took a small step back, not dramatic, just instinctive, like her body was creating distance from something she no longer understood. That does not make sense, she said, but there was no conviction behind it, just habit, just the echo of certainty she had already lost, and I pushed off the truck gently, standing upright again, meeting her eyes without any aggression, without any need to dominate the moment, because that was not how real authority works, and I spoke for the first time since everything shifted, my voice even, controlled, carrying just enough weight to settle things completely. It does not have to make sense to you, I said. Letting the words sit exactly where they needed to, it just has to be accurate, and that was when it truly landed, not just as information, but as reality, and I could see it in her face, the the final piece falling into place, every interaction we had ever had reframed in an instant, every assumption she made about me collapsing under the weight of what she was now being forced to understand, and around us no one moved. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to question, nothing left to clarify, just the quiet, undeniable truth standing right there in the middle of her perfectly controlled neighborhood, and for the first time since this began, Linda Whitmore did not look like someone in charge of anything at all. No one spoke for a few seconds after that, not because they did not have something to say, but because anything they said would have to exist inside a reality that had already shifted, and that takes time. Especially for someone like Linda who had spent years building a version of control that relied on everyone else staying exactly where she expected them to be, and I could see her trying to reconstruct that control piece by piece, her fingers tightening again around her phone like it might still give her leverage, like one more call, one more statement, one more assertion could rewind everything that just happened, but it could not, because the situation was no longer about her interpretation, it was about facts, and facts do not negotiate, and Mark took a slow breath before speaking again. His voice calm but carrying that unmistakable weight of someone who understands exactly how far this has already gone. We are going to de-escalate this right now, he said. Not as a suggestion, but as a decision already made, and one of the officers nodded slightly, stepping back another inch, creating even more space between me and what had moments ago been a confrontation, and I could feel the shift settle deeper into the scene, like pressure releasing from something that had been tightly wound, and Linda let out a short exhale, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice trying to find its earlier strength, but missing it by just enough to make it obvious. "I followed procedure, I reported a violation, you are all acting like I did something wrong," and there it was again, that reliance on process without understanding the limits of it, the belief that following steps automatically makes the outcome justified, and I watched Mark turn toward her fully now, not confrontational, but direct. "You reported a criminal situation that does not exist," he said, each word deliberate, "and you escalated it without verifying basic facts," and Linda's eyes widened just slightly, not in fear, but in realization, the kind that comes when someone finally sees the gap between what they believed and what actually happened, and she shook her head once, quick, dismissive. "He refused to comply, he ignored multiple notices," she said, pointing toward me again, but the gesture lacked force this time. Like it was more habit than conviction, and I could almost trace the timeline in her mind. Every letter she sent, every fine she issued, every time she interpreted silence as defiance instead of patience, and Mark did not raise his voice, did not interrupt, he just let her finish, because sometimes the most effective way to correct someone is to let them fully reveal the assumption they built everything on, and then he answered, steady and precise, "HOA notices do not establish criminal authority," and the sentence landed clean, cutting through everything she had just said, and I could see the impact immediately, the way her posture faltered just a fraction, like something foundational had been pulled out from under her argument. And the officers nearby remained still, but their attention had shifted completely now, no longer scanning me, no longer evaluating me, but watching her, reassessing the origin of the call, and that was the real turning point, not the reveal, not the word supervisor, but the moment responsibility changed direction, and Linda felt it. I could see it in the way her gaze flickered, searching for support that was no longer there. "I was protecting the community," she said, quieter now, almost like she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else, and I let a small breath out, not frustration, not anger, just acknowledgement, because I had heard that line before, in different forms, in different places, people convincing themselves that control equals protection, that authority equals correctness, and it rarely ends the way they expect, and Mark took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to anchor the moment. "Protection requires accuracy," he said, not harsh, just firm, and right now, you do not have that, and the words settled into the space between them, leaving no room for interpretation, and Linda's shoulders dropped slightly, the tension no longer holding her upright the way it had before, and for the first time since this started, she looked less like someone asserting power and more like someone realizing its limits, and I remained where I was, steady, composed, not needing to move, not needing to say anything else, because everything that needed to be said was already in motion, unfolding exactly the way it should, quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. The quiet settled deeper now, not tense anymore, but heavy with understanding, the kind that does not need to be explained out loud, and I watched. Linda's posture shift again, slower this time, like the energy she had been holding onto was finally draining out of her, her shoulders no longer squared, her chin no longer lifted with that practiced authority, and for the first time she looked around, not at me, not at Mark, but at the officers, at the street, at the houses lining both sides like witnesses she had never considered, and I could almost see the realization forming that this was not just a private misunderstanding anymore. This was a moment that had already unfolded in front of too many people to be quietly rewritten, and Mark remained steady where he stood, not closing the situation aggressively, not escalating it further, just holding the line exactly where it needed to be. "This call is being documented," he said, his tone even, professional, and that word documented carried more weight than anything else so far, because it meant permanence. It meant record, it meant this was no longer just an argument about rules or perception, it was something that would exist beyond this driveway, beyond this morning, and Linda's eyes snapped back to him, sharper now, a flicker of urgency returning. "Documented for what?" she asked, and there was a slight edge to it, not defiance, but concern, the kind that comes when consequences start to feel real instead of theoretical, and Mark did not hesitate. "For misuse of emergency services and inaccurate reporting," he said, clear and direct, and the words landed with a quiet finality that echoed longer than any raised voice could have, and I could see it register immediately, the way her breath caught just slightly, the way her stance adjusted again, not outwardly dramatic, but enough to show that something inside had shifted from certainty to calculation, and she looked at me then, really looked, not scanning, not judging, but searching, as if trying to find the version of me she had constructed over the past weeks, the one who ignored her notices, the one who challenged her authority, the one she believed she could manage, and that version was gone now, replaced by something she had never considered, something she could not fit into her framework of control, and I held her gaze evenly, not confrontational, not cold, just present, because there was nothing to prove anymore, and the officer closest to me stepped forward slightly, not toward me, but toward Mark, lowering his voice in a brief exchange that did not need to be heard to be understood, procedure aligning itself with reality, and Linda shifted her weight again, her hand finally dropping completely to her side. The phone now just an object instead of a tool, and when she spoke again her voice was different, quieter, stripped of the authority she had leaned on from the beginning. "I was trying to maintain standards," she said, and it sounded smaller now, not wrong, just incomplete, like a sentence missing its context, and I let a slow breath out, feeling the morning air settle back into something almost normal, the distant sound of a lawn mower starting up a few houses away blending into the background, and Mark nodded once, acknowledging her statement without agreeing with it. "Standards have boundaries," he replied, "and you stepped outside of them, and that was it. No lecture, no escalation, just a clear line drawn between intention and impact," and Linda's gaze dropped for a moment, just a second, but long enough to show that she understood, maybe not fully, maybe not comfortably, but enough, and when she looked back up there was something different there, not acceptance, not yet, but awareness. And the officers began to shift again, subtle movements, radios adjusted, posture easing, the scene transitioning from confrontation to closure, and I stepped back toward my garage, reaching for the edge of the door, the cool metal grounding under my fingers, and for a moment everything felt still again, not frozen, just settled, like the situation had finally reached the point it was always going to reach, and as the garage door started to lower with a soft mechanical hum, I caught Linda's expression one last time, and it was not anger, not frustration, but something quieter, something heavier, the look of someone who had just realized that control is not about how loud you speak or how many rules you enforce, but about understanding exactly where your authority ends and where someone else's begins, and that line, once crossed, does not move just because you want it to. The garage door stopped halfway down with a soft mechanical pause, not because it was broken, but because I let my hand rest on the control a second longer than necessary, the hum lingering in the air like the last note of something unfinished, and I stepped back out into the driveway just enough to see how it was ending, not for confirmation, but because moments like this have a way of revealing more in the quiet aftermath than they do in the confrontation itself, and the officers were already moving with that efficient calm that comes when a situation resolves without complication, radios clipped back into place, shoulders relaxing, voices low and procedural as they coordinated the closeout, and Mark stood slightly apart now, no longer positioned between me and Linda, but angled just enough to acknowledge both sides without favor. The line of authority settled where it belonged, and Linda had not moved much, but everything about her had changed, the way she stood, the way she held herself, even the way she looked at the ground for a second before lifting her eyes again, not to challenge, not to assert, but to process, and I could tell she was replaying it all, not just this morning, but the weeks leading up to it, every envelope she slid into my mailbox, every line she wrote in those notices, every time she interpreted silence as defiance instead of restraint. And that is the thing about quiet people, we are often misunderstood right up until the moment we are not, and then everything clicks at once, sometimes too late to take back what was already set in motion, and one of the officers approached Mark with a small notepad, exchanging a few details, names, time of call, nature of report, all the pieces that turn a moment into a record, and I could hear the faint scratch of pen against paper, steady, methodical, the sound of something being written down that would not change later just because someone wished it would, and Linda noticed that too, her eyes flicking toward the notepad, then back to Mark, a question forming but never fully spoken, because she already knew the answer would not help her, and the neighborhood was fully awake now, a couple of curtains shifting in nearby windows, a car idling at the corner a few seconds longer than necessary before turning away, the quiet curiosity of people who sense something happened but do not yet know what, and I reached up and brushed my hand along the edge of the garage door again, feeling the smooth metal under my fingertips, grounding, familiar, mine, and I pressed the button this time, letting it continue its descent, the panels lowering inch by inch with that steady mechanical rhythm, and as it moved, I stepped forward just enough to stand clear of it, still facing the driveway, still present, and Linda finally spoke again, her voice softer than it had been all morning, not defeated, just different. I did not know, she said, and it was not an excuse, not really, just a statement of fact, and I nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because that was true, she did not know, but she also never asked, never checked, never considered that there might be more to the situation than what she could see from her side of the street, and Mark looked at her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression, not anger, not disappointment exactly, but something heavier, like the realization that personal and professional lines had just collided in a way that could not be easily separated again. And he spoke quietly, "That is why we verify before we escalate," and there was no accusation in it, just a statement that carried its own weight, and the officers finished their notes, one of them giving a small nod in my direction, respectful, understated, before stepping back toward their vehicle, and the tension that had filled the space earlier was gone now, replaced by something calmer, more grounded, like a storm that passed without leaving damage, but still changed the air. And I took one last look around the driveway, the patrol cars, the officers, Mark standing between two worlds he understood very well, and Linda standing just outside the version of control she had relied on for so long, and I let the moment settle fully before turning slightly toward her, not to confront, not to lecture, just to close it cleanly, my voice steady, even, carrying just enough weight to stay with her after everything else faded. "Next time," I said, meeting her eyes briefly, "start with a conversation," and I did not wait for a response, because I did not need one, the point had already been made, and as the garage door reached the ground with a soft final click, sealing off the space behind me, I stepped back inside, leaving the driveway exactly as it was. Except for one thing that would not reset, the understanding that authority is not something you assume, it is something you recognize, and once you get that wrong, everything else follows. The garage felt cooler once the door sealed shut behind me, the faint echo of the outside world muffled into something distant and irrelevant, and for a moment I just stood there with my hand still resting on the control panel, listening to the quiet settle back into place, not the same quiet as before, but a different kind, one that comes after something has already been decided, already been understood, and I could still picture the look on Linda's face as the door came down, not anger, not even embarrassment exactly, but realization, the kind that lingers long after the moment is over, because it forces you to reevaluate more than just what happened, it forces you to question how you got there in the first place. And I moved slowly across the garage, the concrete cool under my boots, the familiar smell of motor oil and dust grounding me in something real again, something simple, and I set my keys down on the workbench with a soft metallic click, letting the weight of the morning fade into something manageable, because situations like that do not stay loud for long, they settle, they organize themselves into memory, into lessons, into quiet reminders that do not need to be repeated out loud to matter. And outside I could still hear the faint rumble of engines as the patrol cars pulled away one by one, the sound diminishing down the street until it blended into the normal rhythm of the neighborhood again, like nothing had happened at all, and that is how it always looks from the outside. Controlled, contained, resolved, but the truth is always in the details, in the small shifts that people carry with them afterward, and I knew Linda would carry this one for a long time, not because of what I said, but because of what she realized on her own, because real understanding does not come from being told, it comes from seeing the consequences unfold in real time and knowing you cannot reverse them. And I leaned back against the workbench, arms resting lightly at my sides, letting my thoughts settle into something clear, something steady, because this was never about winning anything, it was never about proving a point, it was about balance, about making sure things stayed where they belonged, and sometimes that means letting people step past their limits just far enough to see them clearly. And I thought back to the first notice she left on my door, the way the paper felt between my fingers, crisp, official, full of language that assumed authority without ever questioning it, and I remembered how easy it would have been to respond right then, to correct her immediately, to shut it down before it escalated, but that is not always the right move, because some lessons do not land until they play out fully, until the person involved has no choice but to face the gap between what they believed and what is actually true. And I pushed off the bench and walked toward the small side window, looking out at the street through the narrow strip of glass, and I saw her still standing there, just for a second, alone now, the space around her wider than before, emptier, and then she turned slowly and walked back toward her house, not rushed, not dramatic, just quieter than when she came, and that told me everything I needed to know.